All right, and we are live. So thank you everybody for joining, and thank you for all of those who may be watching at a later time. My name is Gayle. I'm the executive director and founder of the Afro-Amerindian Research Cultural Center. We are a nonprofit 501c3 organization based out of Metro Atlanta, focused on the African American and Native American diasporas and overlaps and intersections. And so we typically have every year our Dividing Line Symposium on site in person, hosted or co-hosted with Kennesaw State University. This year we're doing a little departure from that for obvious reasons. And so we are hosting our symposium virtually. And so thank you all for bearing with us and dealing with the change. And so, you know, before we begin, typically there's a lot of conversation, like tongue-in-cheek remarks and whatnot about, the past year, and it's as a way to cope, And so, but that being said, COVID-19, this pandemic, and a lot of the issues that has been brought up through it, have definitely affected both the African American and Native American communities disproportionately in this country. And so I do want to take time to acknowledge that. I mean, our last symposium was literally right before, uh, all of the shutdowns. And in that time, when you just think about these two communities in particular, how many people have been displaced or lost because of this pandemic. And so if you would bear with me, I just want to take just a few minutes as a moment of silence of acknowledgement for the people we've lost due to this pandemic, as well as the people who are struggling and some of the people who will still be affected by it going forward. So if you don't mind just taking a few minutes or a minute. Thank you. All right, so today we are going to be opening our symposium with a conversation on community advocacy and community building. And I would like to introduce our panelists today as we get started. We have Reverend Dr. Waltrina Middleton. She is the Community Renewal Society's 13th executive director. Um, their advocacy work engages marginalized communities from the Black Hills, South Dakota, Charleston, South Carolina, to Hebron, Palestine, and Sao Paulo, Brazil. Honors bestowed upon Reverend Middleton include recognition by Rejuvenate Magazine's 40 Under 40 Professionals to Watch in the nonprofit religious sector, Center for American Progress's 16 to Watch in 2016, and the Jonathan Daniels Memorial Fellowship by the Episcopal Divinity School in support of research on the parallels between activism and the lament in the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and the anti-apartheid movement in Palestine. As a poet, activist, vocalist, social critic, community organizer, and healer committed to the actualizing the vision of a beloved community, Reverend Middleton holds fast to the principles of Ubuntu, which declares, I am because we are because God is. Thank you, Dr. Middleton, for being with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Next, we have Sean Paul Walker. Sean Paul is a mental health professional born and raised in Los Angeles, California. He's been working in the field of mental health for the past 26 years. Sean Paul started his career working with adolescents in residential facilities as a counselor. And by 2006, he moved to North Carolina and began working at a psychiatric hospital for adolescents, working directly with Native American tribes throughout the state. With a master's degree in marriage and family therapy for the last 2 years, he's been working for the Department of Mental Health at the American Indian Counseling Center, which serves Native Americans of all ages across the entire county of Los Angeles. Sean Paul is African American, Cherokee, and is an enrolled citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation. And he is also an esteemed board member for the Afro-Amerindian Research and Cultural Center. So thank you, Sean Paul, for joining us today as well.
Thank you for having me.
So again, like I try to iterate, sometimes we want to keep things slightly loose. I know I kind of started off on the heavy foot, but you know, community advocacy and community building, dealing with these particular communities, it's heavy work. There's a lot of, as I'm sure you all know, intensive labor in many ways. So dealing with that, like, what is your experience with working with African American communities and Native American communities, for that matter, and in which ways do you think they may be linked, or some of their experiences may be linked? I guess we can begin with Sean Paul and then Reverend Middleton.
I would say that they're directly linked. As far as me being a mental health professional, a lot of times the underserved, communities are the first ones to be admitted into these hospitals. Not only that, the limited resources that we have in our communities are a clear factor of where, things are lacking. With this whole COVID thing, like you were speaking about, 2020 has really shown us and opened our eyes to how underserved these communities are. The deaths, the effect of this disease, the lack of education. With some tribes, the language that they have, there is no COVID. So when you go to try to educate them on what this, virus is, there aren't words to describe it. So, when you look at it from that aspect, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a lot of need for education. And I think education is one of the key factors, as well as access to resources.
I agree. And I would say for me personally, my first interconnected relationship, if you will, as a woman of color, growing up in the Deep South, and from the Gullah Sea Islands of South Carolina, with Native American culture, my first encounter was my auntie, my Aunt Lucille Jones, who my grandfather's youngest sister, and she always spoke of the fact that their mother was Cherokee. And here you have this Cherokee elder woman and Black man that create this family together in the South. And you already have this cultural preservation of Gullah culture, where this community of formerly enslaved people were steadfast in preserving language, food, traditions, all of the things that were stolen from them, the names, the language, etc. The education that Sean Paul spoke of is critical. And so here you have these Gullah communities trying to preserve elements of their heritage, and then you have Native community, indigenous community also trying to do the same thing on their own land. And so there's narratives of the Seminole and Gullah community working together. But it was interesting growing up with an auntie who, whenever we had a funeral service, she would do a ritual. It may include feathers or some type of bag that she would place inside the casket. And I never understood, like, what was she doing? I remember when my grandfather passed away, how she honored my grandfather's body with Native American and indigenous ritual. And she was the only auntie that spoke openly, and not that there was any shame, but she was the one who took the time to really get to know and understand that connection. And it wasn't a far away, long distant connection. This was their parents, my great grandparents. And so that was my first encounter But then as I became more engaged with activism and became involved with my family in the Black Hills of the Dakotas and understanding more about the pipeline that threatened to harm their sacred land, to run this pipeline, this oil through their sacred cemetery where they have buried their dead, only to learn through that experience how close to home it was to me in the South, because the pipelines run through North Carolina as well, and getting to know the Lumbee people and understanding that this is not just an isolated struggle, that if we're concerned about water, clear, accessible, safe health water, if we care about, as my brother said, education, if we care about language, all of those things that is critical to our identity and reclaiming our identity which was stolen from us, is all a part of who we are. And it's critical that we, as Black people, understand our interconnectedness with Indigenous communities.
And it's interesting that you brought up the Lumbee. When I was in North Carolina, I had an opportunity to work directly with the Lumbee tribe. Went down to Lumberton, got to see firsthand, just how really bad it was. And that was a turning point for me because I had no idea, so that was a point where I was able to say, let me buckle down and try to focus on helping Natives and African Americans because, the Lumbee, I'm glad that they're, recognized now, because they struggled with that. And so, seeing that firsthand was really an eye-opening, incident for me, or, occurrence.
And the disparities there.
Yeah.
Economic disparities. And it's something that breaks your heart. You drive through the community and you see the level of poverty and the struggles for working class communities. And there's something that resonates in terms of a common thread for other marginalized communities. And so you raise the question, how can we not be concerned with the struggles of others? Absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, as a graduate from the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, I'm very much familiar with the Lumbee community as well, and have many friends, that still live out there and things like that. But and one of the things, I went to school initially for education, right? So I did my student teaching in the community, and I was told like, oh, well, don't go to this school, go to this school. Like they don't like, first off, like this school is more hood than the other one, and this school over here is like you'll get stabbed and this, that, and the third. And then they were like, and then one of the things that was also kind of impressed upon a lot of us was that this school is more Lumbee, therefore they won't like you because you're Black.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And this school had like a race riot and this, that, and the third. And I don't know. I remember having to go and like I had to pick a school to do my student teaching in, and I ended up picking the school that had that reputation. And part of me was just like, well, I'm not that afraid, because I was like, well, I went to Philadelphia public schools in the 90s. So I kind of felt like, well, it's not going to be that bad. And so, I mean, I'll keep my head on a swivel and I'll be all right. And then as I was there at the school, and I was teaching, students of both African American and Native background, one of the things that became very apparent to me was how similar those experiences were. Just in the classroom, I was like, I feel like I'm in my old neighborhood in many ways. And it's just set down here in North Carolina somewhere. And I was just noticing these strong parallels, and as well as the distinctions. But the parallels, I kind of felt like, well, even prior to going to Pembroke, I didn't even know there was a Native community down there. And
Right.
I went to high school. I went to high school in Virginia, and so I was like, well, we're the next state over. How did I not know about any of this? We definitely weren't learning about it in Philadelphia. And so, I think those are other elements that, like, well, if there was just something to thread, these communities together a little bit more, you know, you would actually start seeing like a little bit more of the solidarity kind of take shape, and you might see more community interaction, and that's kind of what brought about even this organization. And so I always found that very interesting, just like how these different communities are linked, or these experiences are shared in so many different ways. Um, but speaking to that, what do you think are some of the largest like systemic issues facing both of these communities or people groups?
Well, first of all, we want to talk about the whole, idea of decolonization. And, we have been to fight amongst each other. And that is an extreme problem. Rather than being compassionate, stepping back and understanding where that person has been, what they've been through, we have been culturally trained not to like one another. And so because that happens, the divisions are very wide and deep. And in order to start mending those, we have to show the parallels, the things that are very similar between us. And until that can happen, and there's an open, form, and minds are opened up, you know, that's when the healing starts. And again, especially with the George Floyd incident, Black Lives Matter. It was interesting to me because I'm in LA, and I saw more Caucasians protesting than anything. And that was eye-opening to me. And at one point I'm thinking, is this just a trend? Or are their eyes really open to, systemic racism and the way we are treated, in the justice system? And so, I'm still on that ledge, wondering, is this just a trend, or are they really seeing?
I appreciate that. I mean, that's a heavy question. I mean, there's so many things that we need to address right now. And I would say for me, on reparations, we look at what has been stolen from us, when we look at how we are still fighting and struggling to be able to have the same footing as others, and to have generational wealth, to be able to one generation to the next, a house without threat of that house going into foreclosure,
Right.
or having homes. I can go home to South Carolina, and there's still fourth, fifth generations of folks in a house without heat, without water or hot water. There's a leak coming from the roof, and they have this land, but they can't even afford to maintain the home, or struggling to, they keep it as heirs property and have this homestead privileges so they can afford the tax. I just think that there needs to be some protection, or ways to offer reparations with respect to all that has been sacrificed by communities that have been marginalized, particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities.
Mm.
But also, I would say, recognizing the critical need for police reform, if not uprooting the police or prison industrial complex altogether. I remember in 2000, between 2015, 2016, the killings, the explained killings of Black women found in prison systems. And most people know of the name of Sandra Bland from Chicago, who was my soror. But most people don't know the name of Sarah Lee Circle Bear, who was a Native woman who was also found dead in her jail cell the same year, just a couple of months apart. And all across the country, from New York to California to Texas to South Carolina to Ohio to Illinois, there were women found dead in their prison cells. And there was not this urgency to find out what's happening to these Black, Brown, and Indigenous women. So solidarity around the suffering that's being imposed upon our communities, and to affirm and to celebrate, our humanity, which is equally valuable as anyone else. you know. And so when I see signs that says Native Lives Matter, I'm like, Ashe, I'm right there with you, and I'm marching right there with you. And I think that, you know, I look to our sister Angela Davis, well, who, when speaking about Palestine, she's like, you know, that, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, I'll never be as eloquent as she is. We're not going to obtain Black liberation if we're not concerned with the struggle of what's happening in Palestine, and understanding the parallel between our struggle. And so I would say the same for the indigenous struggle, that we as Blacks in America must be concerned about the suffering and the marginalization. And so our fight for reparation should be a fight for their reparation. You know, our fight for affirming our humanity should also be the fight to ensure that they are not invisibilized as well. We must make sure that as we pursue freedom and liberation, that we do not ignore the plight of others that are also fighting for freedom as well. So reparations, all of that, reparations.
So, Sean Paul, like with some of these issues that we're discussing, like, are you seeing, from your perspective, are you seeing some of these things being reflected just in how people are processing it, like in terms of like mental health and how people are dealing with it, especially in LA? I'm kind of curious about that.
Well, you know, as you well know, California is quite progressive in a sense, in a lot of ways. It's been interesting to me because I have seen a lot of changes happening within the county. I've seen the Board of Behavioral Sciences sent out an email just last week apologizing for the way they have policies that, you know, promote inequality, and that they're going to start to make changes. You know, the county has done the same thing. Within the county, we've been having these cultural meetings and cultural trainings. Those have increased. And it's not just, you know, I work for American Indian Counseling Center. So it's not just educating people on the Native culture. You know, whatever culture that you come from within our agency, you're being asked to do a presentation, you know, to educate. And so the more you learn about the next person's struggle and what they've been through, I think, you know, minds will change. You know, educating that next person that, you know, may say something that's racist and not even know it. That's been several times within my agency where there's certain people who just, they don't realize that their views may be skewed in certain ways. So again, that goes back to education. And, you know, we do see changes starting to occur, but we still have a long way to go. And as far as mental health, what I've seen within the police department, just in LA County in the last couple of months, they started a new program where if there are certain calls that are related to mental health issues, they're sending a therapist out there with them, a clinician. Clinician is going to be able to gauge whether or not, you know, this is a violent situation, where this is a mental health situation, and that's going to reduce the amount of, you know, incarceration. So these programs are already starting out here.
That's amazing. We may need to have you come to Chicago.
Yes.
That's a piece. I mean, and I appreciate that too, because when we think about the protracted struggle of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, that mental health awareness, removing the stigma from around mental health is so critical. And the depression, you know, suicide lives. You know, my first cousin was one of the 9 murdered in the basement of the Church of Mother Emanuel. You know, I have an altar in my room. I have her picture there. I try not to cry. I have her picture there with my grandparents. You know, I carry her with me every single day. You know, and it's heavy. You don't just get over it. You just don't get past it. You know, and even with the impeachment trial right now, that's triggering for me, because you have people. I wrote the senator in South Carolina and said, hey, you know, it's really critical that you not be partisan here. It is really critical that this is a vote that addresses violence against humanity. And the response from Tim Scott was, well, we want the country to heal and move on. So that's why I'm going to vote to acquit. So I wrote him back and I said, so you're telling me and my family and all those impacted by the atrocities of Emanuel 9 that for us to heal, then we should not hold Dylann Roof accountable. You're saying that there's no accountability for violence, for murder, and for all of those acts that brought us to that moment where someone through rhetoric entered unapologetically into a church and claimed innocent lives. Then for the welfare of our community to heal and move on, we just don't hold anyone accountable. And so when we think about the ongoing evidence and practice of violence in our country, and the idea that we can be killed literally with cameras rolling, knees on the neck, hands around the neck, cameras showing police officers shooting babies within seconds, you know, without any accountability. And now at the highest office in the land, we're saying that there's no accountability for 7 lives lost, people who lost fingers and so forth. That this is the trauma that we carry every single day. And so this work is so critical. We cannot let up because this is our freedom, our lives on the line, but at the same time, it is so triggering and it's so much trauma. And that is why it's so critical for us to be united so that we can disrupt these symptoms, dismantle these systems and say no more. And so I thank you for your work, Sean Paul Walker, because the mental health is so critical. In fact, I have counseling after this session because we have to break the stigma and we have to make sure that we tend to our spirits, our hearts, and our minds.
Yeah, thank you. And I also wanted to point out that, you know, it's important for, you know, us being people of color to represent, you know, part of that mental health, you know, those mental health services. It's really interesting because when we get Native clients that come in, they are so much more open to services because you're one of us, you know, and that just opens them up. You know, it's like, you know, you have Black people who go to services for mental health and then they get this Caucasian therapist and they're like, you can't relate to me. You don't understand, you know, struggles. And so that creates a barrier. So, you know, the more people we can get involved in mental health that are people of color, I think that's going to help, you know, stop these stereotypes of how, you know, that whole crazy thing. You know, I hate that word because it just compounds the stereotypes of mental illness. And, you know, we all have a bit of mental health issues. Everybody goes through depression. Everybody has anxiety, you know? And so these things, you know, it should be okay to address it. It should be okay to say, you know, I have a therapist. I go to a psychiatrist because these are things that we all need.
And also to understand that we don't have to choose. You don't have to choose counseling over your religion. You don't have to choose counseling over your faith. And I think in our traditions, because we uphold the importance of faith, our religiosity so highly, that also contributes to some of the underlying stigmas. You know, well, that may suggest I believe in God. That may suggest that I don't have faith. That, you know, I'm putting my faith in Western medicine versus, you know, this God that is greater than science and medicine and all of these things like that. And so I think being able to show the importance of, yes, caring for your mind, caring for your body, and caring for your spirit. All are valued, and you don't have to sacrifice one over the other. And the community, collective responsibility of the community will help us in that regards as well. When we ask, are you okay? And we actually listen. When we really say, I am because we are, and it's actually true. You know, I cannot be all that I am called to be unless you are all that you are called to be. You know, so really making sure that we are supporting one another in the most authentic ways. You know.
And kind of in that same vein, the every year the Association for the Study of African American Life and History have a theme for Black History Month, and so this year's theme is dealing with Black family representation, identity, and diversity. And so I kind of feel like, what we do with this symposium speaks to that in many ways. And so, you know, because although we tend to not acknowledge it as much, I would like to think that we're all fairly aware of how diverse the African American experience is. And even within families, in terms of like this side of the family is from this part of the country, and this part of the family is from another part of the country, and there's a whole different experience within that. And the one thing that connects us all seems to be our relation to power in this country, and our experiences collectively. And so with that diversity that we tend to have, it kind of does lead to some levels of disconnect, I think, too, and conflict. And so how do we address those issues and kind of build these productive communities? Like, for instance, just in the idea of faith, like I'm Muslim, right? Reverend, you being Christian, and let's say someone else who might follow traditional, religious practices, how do we, and we might all still be in the same family tree. Now, how do we, build that together? And even if we're not in the same bloodline, we may be in the same experience. Now, how do we kind of build a solidarity or a community within that when you still have these other elements that could, sow seeds for division amongst us?
I think having an understanding of our roots, if we are to look at African religiosity, there are hundreds and hundreds of religions and identities of practice. When our ancestors were forced into the Middle Passage, in the belly of those ships, I'm pretty sure that there were different tongues of prayers that went out to their gods, and I know that I speak often about Sojourner Truth, who was separated from her mother from a Dutch plant onto a Dutch plantation, and she built an altar which was reminiscent of Islamic practice or tradition. And it was a cultural memory that allowed this young child to be able to build this altar. How did she know how to build this altar? She was separated from her mother. I'm sure she may have witnessed her mom building some sort of altar, but for her to carry that practice with her, and for that alone to be, and she was an itinerant pastor, but yet in her early formation, she was building an Islamic altar, and I grew up and was raised African Methodist Episcopal, but in my home, I have a Buddhist altar, and so as I travel in Brazil, and practice religion, indigenous religions with my friends and community there, I've learned to have an open heart and spirit, and I borrow from various practices that I embody that speak to me. And I think that it also speaks to who we are as Black, Brown, and Indigenous people when we were enslaved, the necessity to be able to have the double consciousness, to be able to go back and forth between different practices. It didn't mean that you solely were Christian. You could do one thing in the chapel that may have been built on the plantation with the slaveholder there watching you and making sure you're reading from the Bible. And then you go to the brush arbor and you're speaking in tongues, you're in the ring shout, and you're calling upon the gods that your ancestors praised upon on your native African soil. So I think that being able to understand that we are not monolithic in any way, and that also applies to our religious practice, culture, identity, and that we are a diasporic people, you know, and that also means that we will bring to the table diversity in how we say God, Allah, so forth.
You know, recently, I would say within the last couple of years, you know, I was introduced to the term generational trauma. And I want to acknowledge that this is something that's real, but I also want to acknowledge that there's also generational resilience,
Mm-hmm.
you know, especially with people of color. You know, we not only have been through so much trauma, we've learned how to, you know, survive, you know, and get through it. And I think that that shows, you know, in our diversity, because again, you know, when you put your mind to it, you can do whatever you want. So it also goes back to knowledge of self.
Mm.
The more that I learned about my history personally, the more I felt whole, the more I understood why I think the way I think, why I do the things I do. And so knowledge of self and your family history, those are all things that are extremely important to kind of figuring out why you're here, you know, what your purpose is, all of those things. And, you know, I really liked when I was going through after my master's degree, because a lot of we did genealogy, you know, a lot of the curriculum was really learning who you are. And that was something that was very helpful because lets you step back and realize who you are, why you do what you do. And then it also opens your mind to others. So you can look at them and not judge them. You, you know, be able to hear them speak without being judgmental. And so I think those are some elements that if we can embrace those, you know, we would be able to help more as a community.
Oh, sure.
And with that, um, you know, like growing up, like you would hear things from elders about, you know, just your family history or, you know, and you kind of ignore it. You know, that always tends to be like the common thread that at least I've come across. It's like, oh yeah, somebody used to tell me all this stuff all the time when I was like 10 years old. Never really paid attention to it. And now I wish I had, you know. And like you kind of you hear that theme kind of played out a lot. And I kind of and it makes me wonder about, you know, and even then some people who are adults, you know, or elders even, you ask them questions about things and they don't want to acknowledge or come off of that information. And just because maybe revisiting it might be a painful experience, or you know they have their own reasonings behind it. So I mean, with that said, I mean, this idea of knowledge of self and researching yourself, how do we do that, or how do we encourage others who might not even have the interest in it? Like we're still talking to these, you know, these individuals that, you know, they like, hey, that's great and everything that you want to look into all this, but I got to go to work, you know, or I got to go do this over here, you know. I mean, how do we kind of mobilize that or operationalize it?
Well, I think it starts one person at a time. You know, for me and my family, uh, one of my aunts, you know, she basically started looking at our history she was able to do find our ancestors going all the way back to the 1700s. And so when we were able to see that, it gets you interested. So it only takes one person to dive into it and to invest into it and to educate the rest of the family members. And that's how our journey started. So, again, it could just be that one person that steps up and says, you know what, this is what, let me look into this. Let me help us learn about us.
And I agree. And I started out by talking about my Aunt Lucille on my maternal side. Aunt Lucille isn't out here trying to get us all to, immerse into our Cherokee roots. If you want to learn about it, she's available, she's accessible. But for her, this is more than just like a box I check and say I'm Indigenous and I'm Black. It's a lifestyle, it's spiritual, it's everything to her. And so she's unashamed, at funeral services, she will, honor the dead in the rituals and practices, and we see it. So her teaching and sharing with us is practice in living her life. And so we bear witness to who she is. There's no doubt about how she celebrates and affirms the holistic makeup of who she is. For me personally, I was the one who was obsessed with learning our family history, and I did not get the support, but I found ways to capture what was happening right then and now. So I showed up with my little camera I saved up for, and at whatever event, I just recorded. And at that time, it wasn't historical, but 10, 20 years later, I remember when I insisted that we had 5 generations living, and I said, we're gonna do this family portrait. And I got so much hell. I was like, I want everybody to wear white shirts and jeans, and people like, I don't have any jeans, and I'm like, come on, just wear what you got, right? And that family photo was literally the last photo that we have of one relative before she had a stroke, and it was the last time she ever walked again. It was the last photo that we took with my cousin who was murdered with her family as well. I mean, there's so many moments of that's the last time in that photo. And so nearly almost every funeral we've had since then, some part of that series of photos that we took that day is used to document family history, or that may be the only photo that they may have for that relative. On my maternal side, my grandmother's brother and sister, 93, 91 respectively, were in nursing homes, and we had to work to get them to the nursing home so they could see each other, because they were talking about, I don't know how much longer I'm gonna be here. I just set up the video camera in the back of the room, got my great uncle some ice cream. He's sitting there happy eating his ice cream while his 2 sisters are talking over him and just cutting up. And that's the last video that we have of those 3 siblings in their 90s sitting together, their last conversation. No one knew then that that was going to be a historical piece for us. So you can't force people to tell their stories, unfortunately, but you can document what you have. And sometimes you can do it in subtle ways, to mark those moments, because they will become important. But I will say that, remember that we are in the 21st century and we do have access to resources. And so tap into the resources that's available to us. I would say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but be suspicious, because I'm very suspicious of things that's capturing our DNA and capturing information. And I want to make sure that it's going to be helpful for us and not experimental, but at the same time, be open. I know Howard University did an outreach to help people trace their DNA. That's something that I am open to learning more about. And I actually went to the Middleton plantation in Charleston, South Carolina, to try to gain access to their records. Ultimately, they said no, but I'm not going to let that stop me. I'm still researching and still trying to find access so that I can learn more about my family history. And I would also say something that's very affordable is the census. My journey started by going through the census, and I found interviews that was with my grandmother when she had just 2 kids. Now, my grandmother had 16 children. And so in this census clip that I was able to find, they described her as a young woman with a toddler and a child on her hip. So so they described my oldest aunt and uncle. And I was like, oh my God, like I never pictured them as babies. But just having that description and the description of the land around them, because they were in the swamp on the Sea Islands of South Carolina. So they're describing this shack by the swamp. And I'm like, oh my God, like I got to visualize what it looked like at the beginning for my grandmother and grandfather. So there's just so many ways that we can capture and document, even if there's some resistance. And eventually people will be moved and when they see what you're doing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've actually was fortunate enough to interview my grandfather before he passed, about a little bit of less than a year before he passed, um, for a film on our family, which kind of led to the formation of ARC. And I mean, it's always one of those things where like you don't realize what people want to talk about until you have them sitting there talking to you, and you just kind of just spitballing and just and also the small stories that kind of come out, that you don't think anything of until you start looking more into it, and then all of a sudden it's just like, oh, this opened up a whole new like door into a whole other direction that I didn't even expect, and so and then aside from that, there's the sentimental value, where you can always kind of revisit these things, um, and you might pick up something different in it, just from being able to talk to them, or like having talked to them and then having that record.
Building relationship and building trust.
Yeah.
I didn't have a very close relationship with my mother's mom. But when I came home from college, I wanted to build that rapport with her. And she always talked about baseball. And I was like, well, what's the baseball team in New York? I don't know, what are those baseball teams? She was like, that's her team. So I was like, well, we're not going to New York, but there's a little small baseball team in Charleston. And we said, I got us tickets to go to the baseball, the Carolina River Dogs. We went to the Carolina River Dogs baseball game, and their theme song was Who Let the Dogs Out? And my grandma, when they were playing the song, she got up and she was like, woo, woo, woo. I was like, what? Like, what just happened? And we had so much fun. And I think that was the first time I didn't treat her like grandma, but like, yo, let's hang out. Let's get to know each other. And before the day ended, she told me that her first date with my granddad was playing baseball, that her siblings and his siblings, they used to hang out playing baseball after school, And I was like, like you said, she just dropped that. I was like, wow, I didn't know that. So just hanging out and learning that my grandma had moves just like everybody else.
And in those conversations too, it's like sometimes it jogs their memory, like my grandfather would be like, well, oh, I haven't heard that name in forever. Yeah, matter of fact, I just remember this. And all of a sudden, like, there'll be a random day he would just call me and tell me some like obscure fact, just because he was like, yeah, I was thinking about when you mentioned this, I got me thinking, and a week later I just thought about this, so I just thought I'd give you a call and tell you. So it's just like, I think those elements of connection, I think we can't underestimate. And and I think if nothing else, over the past year in this current environment is kind of allowing people to reflect. And this might be an opportunity for more people in these communities to kind of think about how they want to be remembered, and preserving their family histories and their culture, and valuing them in a different way than maybe we took for granted in the past.
You brought up resources earlier. And, you know, I think part of what the pandemic has brought on is this increased use of technology. You know, we're on a Zoom meeting right now. You know, if this pandemic wouldn't have never happened, how, you know, how many people will be using Zoom right now? And the thing that I've experienced is, you know, because of the pandemic, we've had these family Zoom meetings, and it could be, you know, family from across the country, and we're all together, 5, 6 generations, and that's when the storytelling begins. And, you know, you learn so much. And so kind of embracing this type of technology to bring people together. We don't have to have that yearly or bi-yearly family reunion, although it's good to have that. But at the same time, there's something that we can do now. And, you know, I have a meeting set up for 2 weeks with my mom's side of the family, you know, a Zoom meeting. And it's going to be all of us. The same thing happens on my dad's side. So I think that if we can utilize these things, that's documentation right there. And the stories, you know, you're in your own home, so you're comfortable, so you're more at ease. So you're going to just start talking. And I've noticed that that's what happens. And so my nieces, nephews, great nieces, great nephews, they learned so much about my parents because we were all on this Zoom call together.
That's awesome.
And so, like keeping that in mind, since we're about out of time, or running out of time. Um, Lastly, I just kind of want to get into um, how do each of you feel, like what does advocacy mean to you, and how are what are ways? I mean, we touched on some of them, but what are some ways that people can advocate for African American, Afro-Indigenous communities, and Native American communities?
Well, you know, because I do work for the county, I have access to a lot of resources. And my train of thought is, what's the point of having these resources if I don't share them? So the way that I feel like I can help is by, you know, introducing people to all these resources, because there are a lot out there. But if you don't have knowledge of it, you can't utilize it. So basically getting the knowledge out there, sharing the information, and then, you know, you'll have people step up and do the same.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, from a micro level, when you're going into respective communities, you know, being sure that we're sensitive to what those specific local needs are. What are folks asking for? You know, if we talk a lot about water. Water is a real thing. It's a source of life. Education, healthcare. You know, like what is it that impacts communities directly, and how do we support and follow the local leadership to, as my brother shared, provide the resources that's in demand. From a larger perspective, honoring legislation and commitment, local, state, and federal, that will help make transformation in these communities, and not patchwork, but actually make sure that there's sustainable resources that will support generations to come. I know that in the Dakotas, they have been calling for an honoring of the treaties of the tribe nations there, and so that would allow return their land. And President Obama indicated that when he was in office that he would reconvene or be able to revisit the treaties if all of the elders were to come together. And so the Black Hills Unity Conference brought all of the elders from the different tribes together, and yet the treaties were not honored. So we need to make sure that we do not breach these opportunities to honor promises and commitments made to Indigenous communities, but also from a legislative perspective, what can we do to protect the lands? What can we do? And that's on every level. when you see disproportionate foreclosure, land grabbing, gentrification that's violent and disrupting, like I said, generational wealth, what are some legislative policies that could be in place to protect communities, protect the land, and protect and preserve those cultures?
Thank you. And yes, lastly, what are some, I guess, additional like websites, resources that people could possibly go to for ways to support initiatives that you're behind, or uh, just things that you think could assist?
Well, of course, I will say you can visit communityrenewalsociety.org, and you can sign up for our newsletter and learn more about our efforts, our platform issues. It centers around police accountability, and our whole mission is centered around eradicating racism and poverty. But I have spoken throughout our time together today about the Black Hills, and there is the Black Hill Unity Concert. And so I would, they're on social media. I think they're most active on Facebook, even though obviously due to COVID, there is no concert this year, but the concert brings the elders from the various tribes together. It's a time to raise funds and raise awareness around issues that impact Native community, from anything from protecting the buffaloes to preserving the language, to sacred rituals. I mean, it's such a beautiful and spiritual experience, and I hope that they'll have an opportunity to continue once we're on the other side of this. But I definitely, and Native Lives Matter, follow that hashtag, because a lot of the poets, the activists and organizers around Native American and Indigenous rights will be connected to that hashtag. So.
Thank you. And I guess as we wrap, any final thoughts, words?
Well, I would just, I appreciate the discussion and the conversation and the opportunity to be able to, you know, use this platform as a way to, you know, educate others and, you know, put things out there that need to be heard. I would like to, you know, continue to engage in activities like these, because I think the more we're able to have that discussion, the more people will become open to joining in the discussion. And then you have multiple people who are coming in with resources and ideas and, you know, coming together. And I think that that's important, the conversation.
Ashe, Ashe.
Well, with that, I would just like to say thank you to both our guests today. And also, the Dividing Line Symposium is going to be continuing. We have 3 other events going on. The full schedule is available on www.aarccenter.org, arccenter.org. All of our videos for this symposium will be posted on the front page of our website. So as soon as you go to that URL, you'll see whatever event we have going on, as well as the schedule. Again, I would like to thank Reverend Dr. Waltrina Middleton, as well as Sean Paul Walker, for joining us today. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's support our women in leadership, women power. Thank you for the opportunity.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.